So my name is Prasad Shetty, and I welcome all of you to spend this day with us. Uh, I have three tasks to do here. One, to introduce the school, two, to release a book, and three, to introduce the symposium. Okay. So I'll go one by one. Uh, when we started the school, everyone asked us, there are so many schools in Bombay, there were 25 that time. Why do you need another one? And our classical answer was, there are so many children. Why do you want another one? No, but but the whole thing, why do you need another child is always a question that that is funny, but it was also interesting. What do you do with a child? In the past 10 years, the number of colleges in the country have doubled, and number of students graduating have tripled. To be among one of the 500 colleges of architecture, producing 40 students out of 30,000 graduating every year, have two specific challenges. What do we do differently? What do students do when there is so much of oversupply? We were 8 of us coming from different places, different practices, different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking. But all of us wanted to be part of the academia in some way or the other. Arvind, our very dear friend, Arvind Adarkar, he, put us all together. He organized everything, the space, the partnerships, the initiation, tours to Goa, and everything. And then suddenly in August 2013, he left us, just like that. Exactly 1 year later, we started the school, 2014, August 2014. And since then, we've been struggling to articulate our positions, our objectives, our methods. For many of us, it was a complete change in life. I think two things are important to mention here. First, regarding the school, first, the idea of the academic space. And this is something which we've been kind of, talking about since quite some time. The idea of the academic space which goes beyond pedagogy, which goes beyond education, and vested in becoming an academic space, a space of research. So we see ourselves an institute, a research institute doing education, an institute that is open intellectually and actually. Second, we love to ask questions. We love to mix ideas. We love to wander slowly, get lost and enjoy life. And there we premised our methods in the idea of Riyas and the contact with the world. Riyas allowed us a deep inquiry, methodologically. And I think the book that we will be releasing soon talks about it more in depth. That's Anuja's chapter. And at the same time, the contact with the world guarded us from being insular. So these two things are very important for the school. We see the students graduating from C as designers of life, lives of themselves first, and then lives of others around them. Yesterday, we held a graduation ceremony for the first batch which graduated from C. We compiled many of the discussions and articulations that happened in the past 5 years and produced a book, The First Questions. I want to invite Apurva Talpade, who designed this book, to talk about it. The book is layered in many ways. It contains large amounts of interrogations, provocations, responses, and concepts. Each student was asked to give a work that they like, and then with a lot of nudging, a lot of working together, each student has given one work for the book. Each teacher has written a chapter. It's an intellectual biography of the school and has very serious discussions for architecture education and practice. One can read the book in many ways, as each of the elements of the book maintain their autonomy, and one can find their own way to navigate it. You can open a page and navigate from there. I think this has to do with the design, and I'll ask Apurva to talk about it.
Okay. So as Prasad explained, the book puts together all these different modes of thinking about architectural pedagogy by the academic practitioners here. And all of these practitioners come from, like you said, different places, their concerns, their interests, and are all very diversely situated. And what we've done is that we've seen the works given by the students. Sorry? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the students' work is seen as a response to these questions that have been posed by the practitioners. And they're collaborators in these experiments, except that the space of articulation of their thinking has been that of the project. And which is why, while structuring the book, we have used the grid or the graph, because historically it has been a metaphor for framework. And also because the graph is often the paper space where we experiment. And within the book also, when you go through it, you'll see that the graphs have transitions within them. And this was something that was embedded in the works itself. And we think that it speaks to the multiple affiliations and positions that the students have developed here. And therefore, the graph is then motif and metaphor both, and it a device to organize the collection.
Thanks. Thank you. The book is available at the counter. Today, we are selling it at a discounted rate. So here it is. Here's the book. Okay. Thanks, Apurva. So the final thing that I have to say, and the most important thing that I need to say, songs of turbulence. 500 years ago, on the same day, 8th February, a huge storm hits the coast of Netherlands and wipes several towns and villages, killing thousands of people. 100 years ago, as we were just coming out of the First World War and preparing for the second one, on the same day, 8th February 2020, the Swiss men voted against women suffrage. Around 75 years ago, here in this region, territorial boundaries were redrawn and new countries came into existence with lots of people kind of moving across them. Around 50 years ago, we in India entered into a war, into 3 wars actually, with our neighbors. And a little later, a state of emergency was declared, suspending all human rights. Around 30 years ago, the world got restructured again. Many civil wars broke out. And here in India, 2 things happened. We opened the economy and we broke a mosque. Around 20 years ago, Ahmedabad and much of Gujarat got socially and physically restructured. Last year, we drew new territorial boundaries, centralizing a state, and also decided to build a temple on the land where the mosque was broken. While at the same time, successive droughts and floods pushed many lives into killing themselves. This year, since the past 50 days, hundreds of women have been protesting in Delhi against one amendment which the union government has moved to redefine citizenship. Things have been turbulent throughout history of humanity. And one can probably not say that one instance of turbulence is better than the other, or the experiences are different, of course. Today, the Anthropocenic world is set to collapse very soon under its own weight of economic, social, and environmental excesses. Conceptually, the idea of turbulence comes from the disciplines of physics and thermodynamics, where two or more gases or liquids with different tonalities of different pressures and different uh, temperatures, they encounter each other and try to balance the difference in the tonalities. We have to understand it is the force of the pull and not the push. It's a force of the pull that is mobilizing the turbulence. Here, the process of resolution causes immense movements in gases and liquids, where the difference in tonalities catalyze the inert energies of the gases and liquids, launching these energies with immense dismantling and reconstructing capacities. So the turbulence happens because of difference in tonalities, and then things come together, and while they're doing this, they dismantle and reconstruct. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to achieve an equilibrium. They're trying to achieve a balance. It is the experience of dismantling and reconstruction that we call as turbulence. It is important not to forget turbulence seeks equilibrium and balance to get another turbulence going. Classically, we've had two responses to turbulence, either to avoid it or to resist it. Here in the symposium, we dare to ask if there can be other engagements with the turbulence. To figure out ways, if possible, to ride the exaggerated energies. To work out the songs from the growls and the roars. We want to call this the songs of turbulence. All of us here at sea are completely aware of various kinds of turbulences and are constantly working out ways to engage with them. Today, we've invited 5 scholars, practitioners, human beings, to think with us, who have had a long engagement with environmental, social, economic, form-based questions. Their seminal works have been referenced to us at several times. Today, they will be in conversation with people from sea who've had similar questions. The symposium is planned as a series of dialogical conversations and not presentations followed by question answers. The spirit here is to jointly interrogate a question with propositions, provocations, and articulations. I'll let my colleagues Ravi and our first guest, Dilip, to continue with these conversations. I think the first conversation is about wetness. Ravi, Dilip, please.
So, welcome all of you, and I think today is going to be a very, very interrogative kind of a day. I think we are going to make some deep inquiry, some interesting conversations. So, me and Dilip and some of us here, Harshad, all of us go together back to almost 1982 when we met for the first time at SPA as postgraduate students. And ever since then, we've been on and off in touch with each other. And every other occasion that we get to have a little conversation on this, on various subjects that Dilip has been working on. and of course, talking about practice in India. We've kind of grabbed every opportunity. And I must say, I missed the music last evening just because I was discussing the turbulence. And me and Dilip were in that room across, speaking, utilizing that time to kind of talk about our interests and concerns. So, just to give you, let me first quickly tell you that Dilip has just last night received a mail, and his book, the reverse, the Alexander's Eye and Ganga's Descent, has got the prestigious award, the J.B. Jackson Award for Geography. And he's just got the mail last night, and we're all very excited. He's also become a good friend of Bruno Latour, who is very interested in his idea of wetness. And he was just telling me the other day that they sat in a cafe, and Bruno Latour kind of sat there and said, "Tell me about wetness," right? So that is Dilip for us, but generally as a broader introduction to Dilip, he is currently a professor at Harvard and has been a visiting professor at Columbia University. And they've basically made some significant contributions, seminal work in terms of Mississippi floods was the first book where they were looking at the shifting landscape. The second was on Bangalore, and the third one was on Mumbai, which is the soak. They also had an exhibition, I think, in 2009. Yeah, at the Gallery of Modern Art, National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai. And then, of course, now he questions the idea or our perception of the Ganga. So I'm going to not spend much time talking about Dilip, but I think it might be more important that we hear you. So let me welcome Dilip to Cunha.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi. And I mean, and to all the faculty. First of all, congratulations to the faculty, and of course to the students. It's just been such a pleasure to be part of this event. Having been in academia now for a while, I sort of have a foot in academia. I keep a foot out. Academia can be a dangerous place. So it's nice to be partly outside. And I think there's a different liberation, although I must say from what I've seen over here, there seems to be a lot of liberation within the field, within the school, and that's wonderful to see. Wonderful to see the camaraderie between students, faculty, etc. I just want to say one thing about turbulence, and in a storm event, the best place to be is at sea, which might be another way to appreciate your education here, and to look at what you're getting into, and talk with the graduates here, where you go from here. But in some sense, you'll always be at sea. So I want to begin with a short clipping, just to sort of remind you. This being February, we tend to forget what happens in June to September. So I want to play a little video to remind you of another time, and perhaps another place. Okay. Then that's rain. But when rain comes, the question now is, how is it received? So the first way in which it is received is in wetness. So wetness is everywhere before it is somewhere. That's what we always say. To some extent, it is never somewhere. It's always everywhere. You know? So when I say that there is wetness all around us, I mean, it is. We call it humidity. So wetness is in the air. Wetness is in the earth. Wetness is in us. We are actually majority, if you probably all aware of, wetness. But we don't call ourselves water bodies. But then we quench our thirst also. We have fruit. We don't have to have a bottle of water. So when I talk about water, water could be extreme wetness. But when one says actually that wetness is everywhere, it's also to say that wetness, that there's no such thing as dryness. There's only less wet things. So with that appreciation, when you receive the monsoon in wetness, what the rain does is that it just increases this wetness. And with that increase of wetness, you then, begin to hold. So you hold wetness. And that sensibility actually of holding wetness in everything, in plants, in animals, in the air, in the cloud forest, in this, these are all ways by which, a world of wetness holds the monsoon and allows it to persist through the year, So the monsoon does not actually end. It just remains, the wetness of the monsoon remains with us. But unfortunately, we are all educated into another world. Here, the rain is received very differently. Here, the rain falls to a surface, and it falls upon aspirations such as this. This is not all necessarily Mumbai or India, for that matter. But what happens over here is that when the rain comes down, it falls to a geographic surface, and then from there flows to the sea, and then connects up with the wind, and then comes back again the next year, or let's just say in the convection cycle, soon enough comes back to land. That is what we're all educated into. This is a paradigm in which we all learn architecture. We all learn governance. We learn management. We learn our sciences. We learn ecology. We learn it in this particular world. So if you notice, I put a glass building over there because when you think of architecture, you think of water flowing. So wetness holds, water flows. And so when it flows, is one thing that you do is, when you learn architecture, you learn it as shelter. You learn it as separation. When we think of the skin of the building, we think of it as actually a separation from inside, between inside and outside. And so it is designed to keep water out, just as much as the coastline is designed to keep the sea out. So we basically, what you're looking at over here is a land-centric world where water is marginalized. Water must know its place, as opposed to wetness that knows no place. It is everywhere. So with that sort of small introduction, I want to ask this question. How is it that we have been educated into the second paradigm when wetness is everywhere and we don't seem to appreciate it as everywhere, but we learn to appreciate water and land somewhere? So how has this happened? And it's very much by design. It's very much by design. And I want to just carry you through the design possibility and the way I anchor this design possibility is in the world of the early Greeks, which I won't go into explaining too much on. But these are the three ways by which they carried out this design project, which is ongoing. We are still trying to keep water beyond, maintaining the coastline, maintaining the riverbank is an act that just continues to be implemented. It's a project with no end. So we first choose a time, you posit a surface, and then you draw a line. So I'll just take you through each one of these things very, very quickly. So choosing a time. How do you choose a time in which to construct land and water, or to turn wetness into land and water? You work through the hydrologic cycle. So this is the hydrologic cycle that is drawn by Horton, one of the first drawings of the hydrologic cycle. And it is the circulation of water. The drawing that I prefer to use is Paul Clay's drawing of the water cycle, basic framework. But I think he took it from that same drawing because it has the same lines and angles, and it simplifies it. As opposed to this one, which has multiple moments and states of water, places where water passes through. He simplified it to 4 moments, as every child might learn it, and we probably all really use it. And that is number 1 is precipitation, 2 is flow formation, 3 is evaporation, and 4 is cloud formation. So this is time. This is hydrologic time. What we have done is we've chosen one moment of time, or I should say, I'm talking as an early read, but we all practice this paradigm. Okay, we practice the second paradigm. So we choose this as our time of reality. We choose one moment, time of reality. But what happens when we anchor in this one moment? We make all the other moments ephemeral. So therefore, rain comes and goes. Rain is a visitor, where the surface is resident. So the surface. So this is what you do. I mean, how do you anchor in that particular moment of time? You anchor with a surface, So you put a surface. Now, a surface is actually a geometric figure. It's a device. It's a design device, like the grid, if you will, is a design device. So if I'm looking at the surface by which I anchor in this particular moment of time, it's basically a figure, according to Euclid, that has no depth. It has only length and breadth, and no depth. It is very much like a sheet of paper on which we all draw. So it's not so much that the map preceded, I should say the map followed the Earth's surface. In some sense, the paper of the map preceded the Earth's surface. The third thing we do is we draw a line on the surface. Now, what is a line? A line is basically only length, no breadth. That's what a line is. And so you draw a line on this. So in this particular moment, we draw a line, we posit a surface, and we draw a line. So the surface is the first separator. It separates what is above from what is below. And then the line makes a second separation that then is between land and water. And when I say it like this, it is sort of a little misleading, because the act of separation that I'm talking about is a metaphysical act of creation. So what I'm doing is I see wetness, I put a surface, I create waters above and I create waters below. I create an above and below. When I draw a line in wetness, I create land and water. So land that is basically not water, it's dry, and water that is not land, which is wet. And that is the paradigm now that we have. So what do we do in this particular paradigm? If I can just first continue with what the line does on the surface. Basically, the line separates. But what happens is with a river, that when I'm constituting a river, it also calibrates a flow. So it separates, it calibrates, and it contains. That's what you're tasking the line to do. Now remember, this line is a geometric line. It's a design device. You can't assume that every person in the world sees it. You can't assume that indigenous people actually operated by this. So it is a design device that has been constructed to separate and to divide, And so when you see it like this, to some extent, I mean, as architects or as designers, the line is not meant to be seen. Remember, Euclid defined it as all length and no breadth, which means that it is invisible. So we all draw lines, but we don't see them. I know we talk about them as Prasad did in terms of boundary conditions. But what we know when we see a river is we just know water and we know land. We do draw attention now to the riverbank because it is constantly erased by water. And so with that, we then enforce the line with river embankments, with levees, until, of course, we can see it, But it is not initially meant to be seen. So when Heraclitus asked somebody to step across, to step into the river, and basically see that it ever flows, and trying to make a case for time changing, the question to ask is, how did he perceive this line across which he asks you to step? And that issue actually is a design. It's a designed intervention that has already taken place. So that's what you see. You see water and land. You don't see the line. It's meant to disappear. So what do you have with these three things? You have a world now that I can map. I can draw maps. I can construct property. I territorialize. I colonize. Basically, my first act of violence of separating water from land is now perpetuated in all other kinds of violences now that follow. And then, of course, also profiteering that follows from it. Once I have an Earth's surface, I can organize land like the way in which we're living now. Land has become a commodity, and water has become a commodity as a consequence of placing it on a surface. So this is what happens when wetness becomes water. So when you think about a map and how it is drawn, you wait actually for the clouds to pass today, because you're working with Google Maps. So a surveyor doesn't go out when it is raining, and because he can't see the line between land and water, he can't draw a line between land and water. He waits for the rain to stop. And this emphasizes, and this is a sign that he waited for a moment in time. So what does it mean, actually? That we live in a fair weather moment. And we've made all other moments into foul weather moments. That's how the British saw the monsoon. They described it as foul weather. And so we describe it now every day. If you turn on the TV and see predictions, it's a gloomy day, it's a sad day, it's a bad day, when it's raining out there, because it prevents us from doing all the things we love doing. So we've been trained and educated to dislike rain, even though we welcome it because of the heat. We welcome it for utility. We don't welcome it actually as a moment in which we anchor, So here you wait for the maps to pass, and then you constitute a surface. And so the surface is constituted primarily, in a moment of clarity. So I assemble it. So the surface is a field of time moments that have been brought together, if you will, and that's how we operate it. And this time has been erased from us, and so we just take the surface for granted. So here we have two paradigms. On the one hand, you have a geographic surface when you anchor in one moment of time. But what I say is, if you look at the right side, I say that India, perhaps in an ocean of rain, occupies, let's say, anchors and initiates in the first moment, not in the second moment. So in that first moment, when I anchor in rain, I live through the hydrologic cycle with rain. And that gives me a completely different understanding of the world. So over here, you're talking about a surface that is divided between land and water. You're talking about rain that drains as water, and you're talking about a surface that is articulated by separation. So once I do this, I then individuate. So I see a number of people. I individuate you as skin-encapsulated things. I populate the surface with animals, plants, trees. And then, of course, I go into classifying, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other side, you have a thickness between clouds and aquifers in which you operate. So a farmer in India, I suspect, even today, operates between clouds and aquifers, But we, as architects, operate in this first paradigm. So the second paradigm, rain holds as wetness, and it operates through negotiation, not through separation. How do you actually operate within? Which is what I like about the definition of environment that I read in the book. And that is that it is conditions within which we design and live, which is an interesting way of putting it. Others might say environment is our surroundings, which is very different, right? So environment is surrounding, environment is what we live within, So I want to suggest actually that there are two worlds that we have here, that we could inhabit, and I feel all of us do inhabit. They're worlds in dissonance, and that is why, if you will, we are in such chaos. If you think that on one side you have an India, and this is a map which I cannot go into, but this is the map from the Bharat Mata temple in Varanasi, which he photographed, and there are about 82 images in that. It's like constructed in a very interesting way if I had to play it out, but I cannot. But it was a map that, this is a temple that Gandhi inaugurated in 1936, in the hope that India would remain united. But what he forgot is that India was already separated by geography. And that is the tragedy of our existence. On the other side, I want to suggest Sindhu, only for the reason that Indu is raindrop. And Sindhu has been translated, I know, by many as ocean. It's not a geographic ocean. It is a hydrologic ocean in which we all are. That sense of a hydrologic ocean is driven by the raindrop. Driven by the raindrop. So Sindhu is a beautiful word if you think of it as actually constituting raindrop. So it has been translated by many as an ocean and then used as the translation for Indus, etc. And all that thing. I won't go into that. So the question now is, how did Sindhu become India? That is the question to ask now. And I want to suggest, that it is with a river literacy. It is with a line in a moment of time that we've constituted, a land and water out of, or let's say India, out of Sindhu. So these are general points which I won't get into too much. Source is a point. Source is a point at the start of a line. Course is a flow between two lines. And flood is erasure of a line. It's all driven by literacy. So basically the answer to the question of how Sindhu became India is by making Ganga into Ganges, by making wetness. So I want to suggest that Ganga is rain, Ganges is a river, and the two are not translatable. So how did this, and this is my speculation, I'm sure historians might think differently, but I want to suggest that Alexander was the first monarch to travel with a map, a world map. The world map had just come into being in the 6th century BC. Alexander comes here in 320 BC, 320s BC. He is traveling with a map. He's extending the surface of the earth. So the surface was what he was educated into, a geographic surface. To some extent, he was among the first architects. He was designing landscape as he went along. So he comes to India in a rain shadow, So I've drawn that plot on the side over there. You can see that he comes in a rain shadow here, behind this range of mountains, eventually the Himalayas, comes here and then crosses here the Hindu Kush mountains and comes into India. So what does he walk into? He walks into this. He walks into a world of wetness. The first time that he's experiencing wetness of this magnitude. Remember, he's only been in Egypt. He's been in I think. So here he is with this kind of wetness. But what he is, he's basically defeated by this. He can only survive for a year and a half or 2 years in this, and then his men mutiny and go. Now, you don't read books that tell you that he was defeated by rain. What you read about is that he was, that his men got homesick and this and that and the rest of it. Which, well, maybe, but this definitely must have triggered them. Can you imagine the mosquitoes, the this and that, the snakes and, I know they had a terrible fear of elephants and, but wildlife, this is a world that not too many people can live in, right? Especially if you've grown up on a surface, someone within it is looking at it very differently. But yet, today, we live on this geographic surface. That Sindhu has become India, and so the India that is now in the map is the site of architecture, if you will. What happened to that? Yeah. So this is the site of architecture, the site of the nation state, the site of the city, the site of all these objects that sit on a surface, and constituted by a surface. And so is the river, and so is the Ganges. So I cannot take you through the maps of the Ganges. This is what I speak about in the book, and it has some interesting maps that I discovered in various parts of the world. But this is the making of the Ganges, and the question is, how has it been made? By sheer hard work. So if you look at the delta, which Marina will speak about later, and her work is very much in the Bengal Delta. I was just telling her that the word delta privileges river thinking because it channelizes water in a deformation, whereas this in Sindhu would be an estuary. An estuary where the sea is predominant in a sense, sea meaning Sindhu is predominant. So you have this now that has been made over the years. So you can see from even in the last 200, 300 years, the way it has moved from mushy stuff to a clarity of Sundarban islands and channels, that have been triangulated. And really, they've been triangulated by just holding an edge. You can't map mud, that is constantly moving until you have real interventions to hold it in place. And then of course you've channeled it through the plains in now we call North India, and that's of course the first drawing panorama of Varanasi, drawn by Tiefenthaler. And if you notice, all the towers have a particular clarity that is anything but Varanasi in today's world. But and then of course the mountains. The river has been followed into mountains, and so now you know that everyone you ask where is the source of the Ganges, they'll tell you it's in Gangotri. I mean, are you serious? Rain is falling all over. How do you begin at a point? I mean, is it just symbolic? But I have traced this into a surveyor's decision that this is the source of the Ganges. A point. I've read stories where pilgrims have gone to Haridwar, and that was considered to some extent the beginning, and then went to just dispersed into the mountains because the entirety of the mountains was seen as the source. But the British surveyor persevered to a point, because he was looking for the start of a line. That when you begin, if you're drawing a line, you have to begin somewhere. That's what he did. So now with that, I mean, if you think about what the Ganges, what we have created through this design, is that we have constituted a river that is a river of civilization, if you will, and of course the drain of settlement. So today, this is what we teach children, that the rivers drain the land, and so the rivers have become drains. And so we should not be surprised. This is a paradigm that has long been in the making, and there's no way that anybody can clean the Ganga, because what you're trying to do is clean the Ganges, and that is an impossible task. So then you've trained it. I mean, if you're talking today about linking India's rivers, damming rivers, it is precisely because we can hold a river between two lines. If you look at the Amazon does not have any dams on it. What the Amazon does is it has channels that have been created off the track, and then with the two lines you can then dam. So this sensibility actually of first drawing two lines and then constituting an element that you can then control in some manner is on steroids with the Ganges and Kotli's canal system, of the Doab, and what the British did was really make this a hydraulic feat, And then, of course, you also have a thing now that I can grant rights to. Now, this is becoming a subject of conflict. I know that it has been done with good intentions because you think that, okay, the Ganges is, a goddess, and therefore, you might grant it rights. But this is a human creation. Who is defining what is given rights? And this is something I got from a school in Delhi that was flashing these, this as this was a couple of years ago, and I thought it was quite fantastic, that now you have a river that's in the same category as aged beings and animals. And then you have this. I mean, this is of course considered to be a very proud moment by many people, and it attracts things. But this is becoming a monstrosity. This is an ecological disaster. Whatever you say about its management systems, this kind of understanding where people are going to worship a contained entity, a goddess that they see between lines. How do you actually see and put a goddess between lines? That sensibility is strange, if nothing else. It should alert us that something is wrong here. That infinity and a river don't go together. But the Ganga does her own thing. Ganga, as rain, refuses Alexander's eye. And so she descends. And this is her descent. I was there in those top filled I was actually in the Himalayas witnessing it coming down. And the way we are we are constructing over there is a tragedy. I think a real tragedy. And so this is a tragedy that's unfolding on all levels. And so the Ganga, first of all, cannot be contained to a geographic space. It cannot be contained to India. It occupies and extends further, So I've included newspapers even from Bombay, like the Devil in the Deep Blue Sea is very much a Bombay newspaper. So we have a choice between two systems over here. You have a geographic surface and you have wetness to choose from, in terms of this thing, or in terms of the Ganges. You have on the one hand, this phenomenon where everybody understands the Ganges somehow as coming down the locks of Shiva's hair. What I say over there is, if you want to believe that myth, in the same, why don't you say it's come down every individual hair, and being a god, he is then infinite, and that's rain more than it is rivers, as a myth. So we can actually translate our text very differently on the basis of wetness. So this is what we all come to believe in. This is the river that we've all come to believe in. And this is the India that we all come to believe in, where land has a place. I mean, I should say, land dominates water. Water has a place. Land is everywhere. I can reclaim land at will anytime I want from water. My favorite line is, when is water going to have a Me Too movement? In order to establish its rights. So now, just to sort of move from there to remind you of a project that Ravi mentioned with soak. I see soak actually, and what we were doing in soak as really trying to recover the wetness that is possible in a place like this. And it's systems of holding, systems of appreciation of rain, rather than the systems that the government is putting in place, which is really draining water off the land. And so we really, what we said is, there are two worlds that you live with over here. On the one hand, you have Bombay, the island city. On the other hand, you have the possibility of Mumbai in an estuary in the monsoon. And so we were looking at estuary not as a meeting ground of land and sea, as an ecologist might define it, because what we say is that when rain falls all over, rain doesn't find, search for channels. It just goes to the sea, if you will. And that going to the sea suggests actually that the estuaries everywhere. So when we say Mumbai in an estuary, we were really looking at an estuary as a ubiquitous wetness in Mumbai. And on the other hand, you have this island city that has been 400 years in the making and drawing that we have portrayed. And then you have interventions like this. You have master plans that are island-like. So this is Bombay Island being designed as the colonists designed it, as the colonizer designed it for 200 years, making an island. And we now make islands within islands, land uses in which we expect people to live. There's the market, there's the residence, there's this, there's that. And this is what you actually find in an estuary. Mumbai in an estuary is more akin to this, which is what I loved about yesterday's presentations, and what I saw and got glimpses of in the liminal zone that you were talking about, in the homes that you were beginning to appreciate. I saw a glimpse actually of an appreciation of Mumbai in an estuary, and not Mumbai, and not Bombay, the island city. So we went into two projects actually that might work. Different modes of representation that challenge the plan that stressed an island city. As opposed to that, we worked with section that admitted the sea and that operated much more in that, let us say, in that liminal zone that is now free as an estuary. I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a conversation, Ravi.
Okay, so Dilip, when we were in college, one of the things that we were told was you don't need to speak, you don't need to write, just learn to draw. That's your language. And so all my life, I've been drawing lines, sets of lines and lines. And now this guy is telling me to forget the line. And not just forget the line, but he's also saying erase the old ones. So that's interesting. And I think, I don't mind, we can probably start looking at the world through the sections and all that you do. But here is something that I want to, and you briefly mentioned the Ganga and the identification of Ganga as mother. And in fact, in the in our thesis group right now, there is a student who's kind of working on the idea of looking at Godavari as a river. And so we were discussing, and one of the things that came to my mind is that, and probably emanates from your book, is to begin to see how different people have seen the surface or have seen the existence of this wetness, let me put it that way. And so I just, instead of kind of going through the details of each one of them, I just will focus on one of the aspects. And she pointed out that Godavari is the mother. And so we started discussing this idea of this personification. And like in various mythological stories, we do see this personification. But I think what's interesting here is that in this personification is embedded a relationship with self. When I say mother, it is not only the position of mother, but it's also my relationship. And to some extent, I believe that in that kind of a relationship, in that kind of a space, I am in a relationship. And therefore, reverence, respect, being very careful about what you do with it, all of these which are in the human relationship actually come in the act of kind of developing a relationship with the river. And so the question is, and I really don't know when you question the Kumbh Mela, whether they really are going to the bank of a river or are they really marching to a line? Or are they just going to visit Mama? Just to kind of put it. So is that the kind of space? And if that is the kind of space, then there are many questions. Do we draw it at all? And can we draw it? Is that fuzziness over the globe the way to represent, or is there something more? So just to kind of open up that idea of a personification and that kind of relationship, is that something that you find, where you may find another way of looking at the...
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I tell you what I would do. In terms of clarifying what personification is, I would distinguish personification from individuation. What we do in landscape or in the paradigm of the geographic surface, we tend to individuate things. And individuate things means single them out, separate them. The thing about personification is that you have a respect, as you, I think, rightly point out, in terms of the the relationship that is constituted. It's a relationship that binds you within. So it is not so much mother as an other, but the womb of the mother in which I am. Right. That would be a nice way of looking at personification. And if I'm actually within that, it's so contrasting to the individuation that drives my separation from an other. So the Kumbh Mela that as you rightly point out, and the kind of the pilgrims that we observed even in going to Gangotri, they were not even conscious actually that they were on a river. My joke was with Anu, who I should mention as very much a partner in this, and would have loved to have been here. I used to joke that these people are there. They're driving in their vehicles, all going to Gangotri. They might as well be under the sea. They wouldn't know the difference. They were not looking. They were just being. And so that sense of being, they're going to where they're told, yes, they're being direct. And this conflicting world of individuation and personification, an individuation that suggests that they must go there and nowhere else, as opposed to personification that that they're not really looking, they're just doing what they're told to do. It doesn't really matter to them, but they are looking at a mother potentially and being within, I think is very valid. But this is when you realize that this sort of conflicting of two worlds that we all inhabit in some form or the other. I mean, yesterday we saw, I think, some wonderful examples of that also. When you talk about the formal and the informal, we refer to, the world of personification is referred to as informal, or it is put within religion, or it is put within, worlds of mythology, but not really constituting reality. But if I had to think that in the world of personification, I am driven to negotiate, not to separate. I swim my way, in the womb, as it were, and I push things aside, I move things, I deflect things, I work with and always in dialogue. So I feel that sense of individuation versus personification, I think, sort of gets to this thing. And I like that distinction very much, I think, in terms of playing out the difference between what I would call river and rain, or, and the paradigm. And two paradigms. Yeah.
So just to kind of add, I think the other day Prashant Heda was also Anu's classmate, was in Delhi, and we got into a conversation on exactly this whole issue of river. And he's obviously a GIS expert, and so he has a way of looking at these things very differently. And he was working with the government of Bihar. And so obviously the government, and basically it was the Kosi floods that kind of took the Orwell team there, and he's part of that. And so he was saying that when we were speaking to the engineers there, they were saying that to build roads in that region where the Kosi kind of opens up from that, Himalayas and the gorge, the kind of a space, and then opens up. He says the engineers were so concerned that it is so expensive, so cumbersome, because the gradient there is something like 1 in 7,500. And the river just keeps changing its course. And they say that it's very difficult for us because, it's that understanding of, a ground. And so I think to that extent, it makes that point very interesting. But the locals call it the Chanchal Kanya. Right? She might just behave any other way that she wants to. She just kind of. So I think that the locals have then adjusted. And so I think as a design thinking process, maybe it becomes very interesting that it's constant negotiation mode. And there is no firm positioning, or in fact, the notion of permanence also then kind of comes into the discussion of this kind of space. So that's one. The other important aspect I thought, which maybe we could quickly discuss, is do you think that over the recent past, the idea, the line has come in a much stronger manner through the idea of the self? And when I say the idea of the self, is that it is about my privacy, my space, definition of property, and many more things of the kind. And so do you think that we may have to deconstruct the idea of the self to be able to kind of, embrace this all-pervasive or the ubiquitous environment and work through, in some ways, work through a collective negotiation? And there's one more thing, and therefore, does the vocabulary then become something that is related with imagination and embedding it on a surface to a sense of consciousness, of collective consciousness about? So, and it's not, because there is no me in this whole thing. Or if there is a me, then that me is very different in that idea of consciousness. So,
let me first, respond to this, your comment on the Kosi. One of the things that I guess we make presentations in a few places, but last year, a couple of years ago, we were invited to speak at in Edinburgh, and the Consular General of Indian Consular General was there, and she was just a wonderful person, And when she first came in for the talk, she had just been told that we're going to speak about landscape, and she first said, I know very little about gardens, and so she thought we were going to speak about gardens. Anyway, so when we spoke about something along these lines, then she got up straight away after I presented. She gets up and she says, I take it that I'm the senior most over here, and so I reserve the right to ask the first or to respond first, And then it turns out that she was actually in charge of the Kosi area, as an administrative, as an IAS. I know how she was an IAS person, and she was in charge. That was one of her first assignments. And she says, "What you're saying is so right." She said, "We just keep wanting to control this thing, and it doesn't want to be controlled, and we are just wasting our money. The government is wasting money, not just here, but across UP, across Bihar, and that whole thing." I just thought it was fascinating. But what is interesting about it is that can we give up the it? When we even, the language that we are educated into still refers to the Kosi as an it, rather than things. So in some sense, the person who's living there is not accommodating the shifting landscape. As we wrote in Mississippi, we were still in that mode of actually looking at the river in its shifting ground. And many GIS folks are very interested in this movement. It's very captivating. There's a lot of mapping. But to some extent, that is, a kind of language that persists with individuation. It's just that it allows it to sort of move. And I would think that the way in which people inhabited this kind of ground is not to see something moving here and there. They just raised themselves on mounds. They raised themselves on mounds and allowed, the Kosi, always a name. You never refer to the mother as an it, So you talk about it, you talk about the Kosi as being accommodated by your height. So you have low ground, high ground, and that is why we believe so much in the use of the section as opposed to the plan that encourages the it and the movement. The self concept is actually also very interesting, and I think, as you rightly point out, it is something that has increased over there. So one of the things that we have noticed in all our studies of the maps and everything is that the coastline has hardened, the river line has hardened. The line that holds the Mississippi in place is now 50 feet high. When 2 centuries ago, it was 4 feet. It was 50 feet, and now it's a whole system. And in all of that, actually, it is in some sense a separation from, I should say, a clarification of us as participating, individuals in a democracy or in a technocracy or whatever you wish. And that. So our governing system, then, which actually enters design in a participatory mode. You actually count heads, in terms of this thing, and you hear voices of people, and that sense of individuality that gathers in the collective and is then participating in watershed issues or river issues is one whole paradigm of thing that we are sort of up against very often when we are talking, when we come in, into a place that has had floods or something of that sort. But over here, what one is dealing with is not so much. In the world of Ganga, or you say in the world of Sindhu, one is not dealing so much with a set of individuals, as much as a world that opens up in some sense around a dialogical sensibility, that where there is no it there and there's no it on this side as well, maybe I should.
Yeah, and just to kind of elaborate, that there's so much around this self, the whole economic system, the monetary system, the ideas of development are all around this idea of the self of an institution, self of a nation, borders, boundaries, and so I took this very batch that graduated. We went to Jaisalmer. An interesting thing about the line was one of the very senior old gentlemen whom we were talking to. He just told me one very nice, hard-hitting line. He said, I did not realize. When did I become a smuggler from a trader? And that was because this new boundary was drawn. This new line was drawn between India and Pakistan. Because Jaisalmer used to actually trade much more with the West than this part of the world. So coming to Jaisalmer, and that's another issue that actually there's a book out there which we call Jaisalmer on Water. Maybe we should have written it as Jaisalmer on Wetness, now that I think of it. But nonetheless, so we were studying and looking at this architecture, the beautiful architecture that we appreciate. And then I saw these buildings in a space that gets 60 mm of rain, has these rainwater spouts which are 60 centimeters long. And I was just wondering, what is this spout doing here? In a space that is 60 mm rain, number one. Number two, most houses have a tanka where they actually collect the rainwater down inside. And then I started looking at the articulation. And we had David Cardoz along with us. I don't know if he's here. They were all looking at the state of the wall of the fort, which was kind of declining because of water supply. All right, and drainage beginning to. So I was just trying to connect these two things, and maybe the articulation that you see on the surface of any of these buildings is actually, my speculation is to keep the wetness away, because the stone the materiality of it just cannot deal with it, and therefore you see this series of these little chhajas which are probably that much. I'm sure they don't do anything to summer or shade. So that was one of the questions. That was one hand that the city was trying to or the architecture was trying to deal with this wetness, so to say. And on another level, we were trying to look at the growth of Jaisalmer and how did it kind of sit in this desert and survive, and what was its relationship with its surrounding. And so there was this other patch of a little green area somewhere where they constructed little bunds and worked with holding an overflow of whatever little water that they got and worked through that moisture for food production. So they worked again with that wetness. So on one hand, in their architecture, they were very careful about that wetness. They were kind of generating a whole life out of that wetness. And on the third, there were a whole lot of cultural objects that they had created to kind of work through this use and reuse of water. And therefore, they kind of enjoyed that. In some ways, they celebrated that process through a whole lot of cultural objects. So but I don't think we in schools of architecture actually look at these things very, generally speaking. And I think that was quite an eye-opener for us. So, just to kind of add to that point of wetness.
I think sometimes I have a problem with architecture itself as a discipline, as a discipline that has been implanted, by I should say the geographic, or let's say the keepers of the geographic surface. And so when you think of the building, when I think of my education as an architect, I was educated basically to design the skin of a building, a separation from between inside and outside. So the architecture must have an inside somehow, and so when I use the word shelter, I use the word this thing, there's a way by which educated to keep the elements out, to keep the elements out. And so if I design with a courtyard, or I design with a veranda, or I design with a thing, somehow I'm giving in to an outside. And so I look at it as, a sort of this, in the projects that we saw yesterday was very much on that ground of the extension of the building and so on. but that's the vocabulary in which I've been educated, and that's with architect. So I designed, for form, I designed the skin with form, I designed the skin with openings, I designed the skin with, all kinds of whatever detailing. But that's what I was primarily doing. I was designing separation. That's what I was doing. I was designing separation and the art of separation, which I think is so deeply ingrained in architecture that we do not still include the hut as architecture. We think of it as, design without architects and, so things like that, nonsense thoughts, and then I think of the person who's living in a hut with thatch and not concerned actually with an inside-outside separation. They're concerned with home, if you use a word from yesterday, as opposed to house. They're concerned with home. And that's the way they're operating. So there's some way that larger question of whether one is even talking about architecture as the problem in the scene. So when you talk of the rainwater spout that is, sort of protecting the world, I'm not surprised at all that the world all over is moved to steel and glass and aluminum, because it is easy, it's easy to keep the water out. That's what you're doing. They've made increasingly impervious surfaces, moving towards concrete, as opposed to, even earthen walls, brick walls that absorbed water, or, at least, even if it was designed with that intention of keeping out. But one of the things, if I can extend this to another scale, I'm talking about the city. When we think of the city as the quintessential settlement, what really makes it quintessential is its dryness. It is the classic geographic surface occupant. And that is why also yesterday I was so keen that, can we architects give up on the city just as much as we can give up on the building, or the sense of that inside, outside,
or the line,
or, the line thing. But the notion of the city as the quintessentially dry, or let's say controlled environment where I drain off water as fast as possible, makes it different from the village where, you get muddy surfaces and grounds that are soft and things like that. So that's what distinguishes it, So if I can just sort of, think of the act of separation as even more fundamental than the line, and that is what drives this model of thinking and designing. Then the alternative of negotiation that you're talking about, even in the wetness, that what we are seeing over here is a world of holdings of wetness, and it's a different way of even reading ground and reading a world now of mythology, and so things that celebrate it, unfortunately, are read on the terms of land water systems, and so we don't quite get to it. But
Yeah. So, just to kind of, like we were discussing the other day, I think it's about time that we kind of give up this difference between the informal and the formal. I think we should now begin to call it the normal and the formal. I think that would be a good idea and that's the word, I think. So I will stop there. I think we also are in that moment of time. So I'm going to open it up to questions, if any, and we have, yes. I think what I may want to do is be brief. Please stand up, introduce yourself, and that'll be useful so that everybody can see who's asking the question. And maybe we might group some questions too. So I'll just kind of organize that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Pranay Kodania, third year student at SCA. And my question is, it's not so specific towards wetness, it's more generic to this larger ecological argument which is placed. What I feel like some ecological arguments that we sort of theorize, the way in which we theorize it is sort of problematic. Like, for example, like in our landscape module with Ravi, we sort of discussed this fashionable concept that we started conceptualizing over the last decade called the Anthropocene. And Anthropocene has a very easy story to say. It's easy because it doesn't challenge naturalized inequality, urban inequalities, alienations, violence. And all of these concepts are in this.
What's your question? You have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of these concepts get into this modernity, strategic relations to power and production. So, it would be great if you could give some light on how the ecological arguments or the Anthropocene argument, they are problematic theoretically and philosophically, maybe in the way how it separates man from nature, this entire Anthropocene argument, or how capitalism or the asymmetries produced by capitalism or power is sort of erased from
Yeah.
the equation.
Yeah. Anybody else? I'll just take the next. Yeah. Here.
I have a question, meanwhile.
Yeah.
So, very nice. Dilip, very nice. I just, I just felt a contradiction, a small contradiction I want to kind of, pose to you. The idea of the world being different intensities of witnesses is also very liberating in the sense that it's kind of, it's like you move from one state to another state and stuff like that. Now then, what is the worry about? Because the line which transforms itself into the hard line or the bank or the edge, etc., that is also a different intensity of wetness. Then what is the worry about? What is it? Is it gradation? Is it water time? What is it?
Sorry.
I'm Himanshu.
Yeah, Himanshu.
Dilip, we walked in late, but I've seen so very carefully when it was shown. And what you said, which I caught at the end. So my question is about that and ties with Prasad's. When you say that the problem is with the plan, we acknowledge the problem with the line. I see that there is actually a crisis of representation. Because all representation will reduce, otherwise there is no representation. So when you replace the plan with the section, you are exchanging tracks. Right? So I think the question is, how do you deal with this question of representation? Which is what you are identifying fundamentally as the perverting element. Right? And which therefore means brings us to the connection between representation, reality, and mediated through practice.
Just for introduction, he is Himanshu Burte.
I'm Jivesh from Delhi.
Yeah.
This is a brilliant, really opened up a lot. The wetness is there in public life as a discussion. If you see apocalyptic imagery in cinema, is classic Blade Runner is wetness. The wetness blurs lines, wetness blurs the human to the non-human. So in a sense, it is there in the kind of psychogeography of the living. Like today morning, I was walking in the opposite YMCA, there is this building, and the only thing that you remember is that building because it has a tree growing through it, and it actually is a kind of very powerful image of wetness. So that the seepage of living, that the architects always worry over, and they curse the plumber because seepage technique apart. This fight to the organizing seepage produces continuous imaginary. So I was just wondering whether the line is wiped away or there is a series of epistemic moves that we make with the line, which is identification, which is a series of statist way of organizing space versus the blurring of life, of living. So actually there will be two epistemologies which is contesting with each other, and that completely makes it obdurate to so the wetness becomes nostalgic. So the Bombay, if I talk about the Bombay that I walked today, to say some other way, you'll be nostalgic about the old Bombay. Because that's the wetness of the city. I was just wondering.
Yeah. Do you want to take, I think it's the three different
questions. Okay, so if I can just go backwards, perhaps, one of the things that particularly in the erstwhile colonial era, what was done is rain was demeaned, wetness was demeaned, and so that constant it wasn't just the rise of the geographic surface in terms of what you're describing an epistemic regime, if you will. It was also the purposeful critique of rain and wetness that now smacks of a pre-colonial era or a rural kind of condition or a violence like the deluge, that we made it out. But that is all part of this, or part of the constitution and I would almost say the wickedness of a geographic surface paradigm that has thing. But I mean, this is to be a longer conversation, I think, in terms of, I think this is a very good point. The thing of representation is a very critical one, I think, and as you rightly point out, the only that move from plan to section, is to some extent can fall within a similar, let's say, a category. I mean, and certainly we use sections, but generally always after the plan. The idea, though, is this, that when one inhabits wetness, one is very conscious of clouds and aquifers. So, you're always looking down a well, or you're looking at the clouds. That sense of operating without a surface, but fluidly in this world, is defied by the map. And the map gives you the surface. But that is not a satisfactory answer to your second point, I think, about practices. I mean, if I move in that direction, I'm actually doing away with representation altogether. Representation is an act that has been introduced in a professional realm, and as a device, and it can be oppressive as a device because it takes away from self-help. It is now, I'm always the outsider, I come in there. So your question is a very good one and points in that direction, actually, where can we do architecture without? And I was having this very interesting conversation with Malka Singh yesterday, and how he, was, sort of is dealing with craftsmen directly in a manner without drawings. So representation has been introduced as an act in the geographic surface. So with that as a backdrop, I take your critique of the section, as a... I think the issue of I've forgotten the degrees, the degrees of wetness. I think that here again, I mean, I feel that there is. I think the main point. I think the difference between the line between water and wetness and the line, this thing is really this thickness of operation and from within that gives you a different sensibility, I would think, of a boundary. That if you are within something, a boundary. There is no concept to some extent of a boundary. You're merely deflecting, pushing aside. You're doing things. You're making way in some sense. And I thought, like for example, when you were talking about architecture, as when in your introduction, when you spoke about architecture as we're talking about getting lost and this thing, part of having fun, getting lost. And I thought it was fantastic because I feel that, Henry David Thoreau's essay, Walking, if you read it, in some sense, he's also suggesting that the best way to be, in some sense, is to be lost. Is to be lost because then if you could push it a little further, he was saying get lost, not to find one's way, but to make one's way. There's a big difference, actually. So there's nothing to read over there. It's about making. So in that sensibility, degrees, when you're saying degrees, is a way of articulating, differences that to some extent is an abstraction. I take it, but it is something to play out. And I would like to build a vocabulary that doesn't fall back on differences that associate in some sense with degrees between some extreme, because you get a sense of an extreme, and then it's only relativist kind of ground. So there is room for thought there in terms of how to clarify what the language of practice might be within wetness. The question of the Anthropocene and ecology, all of ecology is written on the basis of a land-water divide and a surface. And it's interesting, no ecologist has come to me actually to debate this issue, because I consider, for example, issues of flood. Flood is an absolute design creation. It's a designed creation. And there's no such thing as a natural disaster. But we still believe, an ecologist still believes in flood as a natural phenomenon. you know. And so the Anthropocene as a condition, I mean, as an era, is driven actually by a paradigm of a geographic surface. And I have my problems with it on political grounds, I have my problems with it on ecological grounds, but I fundamentally have my problems on paradigmatic grounds, you know, that it is not a concept in wetness. And so, you know, rather than, and I find this to be a problem actually with the whole climate change debate, you know, wherein you're roping the whole world into a problem that actually has one answer to it. I mean, that it's a problem of design of a surface. You've created this problem, and it is some people who have done it, who have taken advantage of it, whereas those, you know, like in the whole monsoon belt, continues to be developing. They remain, in my view, outside of the Anthropocene, you know, and they've never been part of a conversation on the thing. I mean, still today, when there's a hurricane that hits the United States, they still run to the Netherlands for solutions because somehow this country has mastered the art of separating land from water. You know, so this thing is that next time a hurricane hits, you should be going to Bangladesh and not to the Netherlands. When that happens, then we'll be out of the, you know, we'll be, you know, in a different geological era. It may have a different name. It'll, you know, it won't be Anthropocene. You know, so
yeah, just to kind of, I'm sorry, we're going to run out of, we are out of time, absolutely. And she's also finished all her papers of minutes, so this is the last thing, but I think in the overall geopolitics, my suspicion of this climate change regime is a new order of global control. It's a new method of colonization that is very likely to occur. And I think its symbols its seeds were kind of when everybody wanted to tell Brazil how to deal with their Amazon forest fire. And I think it's coming. So anyway, it's part of that larger turbulent time. And thank you very much. I think thank you, Dilip. It was wonderful. Thank you.